preventing Jews from holding any kind of employment, and ultimately encouraging Jews to uh, to to immigrate from Germany and Austria. So a sort of forced deportation, if you will, of German and Austrian Jews to other nations if they could find some place to go. I'm not going to get into any further detail on that part of the story because it predates the war and falls outside of our area or time frame of interest. The two second and third phases I will spend a little bit more time on because they fall directly within the confines of the Second World War. So if we look at 1939 to about the middle of 1941, we find that increasing numbers of Jews under Nazi control, particularly Polish Jews, are concentrated in urban ghettos in occupied Poland. And at that stage of the process, there was not as yet any purpose-designed murder facilities that were operating. But of course, Jews and other so-called enemies of the state were already being murdered in some numbers through improvisational roundups and arrests and that kind of thing. There was definitely killing at this stage, but it was not widely coordinated, and there didn't seem to be any overarching scheme at work yet. And then during the period from about the middle of 1941 up until virtually the last days of the war in 1945, we have the regime working at full speed to destroy its so-called racial enemies. This included all Jews who fell under Nazi control in Germany and beyond in occupied Europe, as well as various other enemies, so-called enemies of the state, who were targeted by the Nazis in mass killing efforts, which were equally categorized as genocides, just as the Holocaust against the Jews should be. So we can sort of break that most deadly phase into a series of sub-stages, if you will. Some of them we've already talked about when we were looking at the the German operations on the Eastern Front in the First and Second World War back on the 24th of January. We looked at the actions of the Einsatzgruppen in occupied Soviet territory. And we saw how the mobile death squads of the Einsatzgruppen moved around occupied Soviet territory and set about murdering all of the Soviet Jews that they could possibly find, irrespective of who they were or where they happened to live. And then in early 1942, a bit of a turning point comes from a policy standpoint that is usually marked in the historical literature by the Wannsee Conference, which I will get into in a moment. And this is what really leads into the systematic deportation of European Jews from Western Europe as well as other parts of Nazi-controlled Europe to purpose-built murder facilities mainly situated in occupied Poland. These are the famous death camps that we see so often represented in films about the Holocaust. And that phase of systematic murder in purpose-built facilities, was carried out from 1942 or even late 1941, right up until the end of the war. So, in the time that remains, I want to look at just a few parts of this larger chronology for comparative purposes with the genocide of the First World War. So, briefly on the early measures of 1939 and 1941, we should begin not so much at this stage with the persecution and ultimate genocide of European Jews, but rather with a program of mass killing which the Nazis implemented in 1939, right at the outbreak of war, which is known as the T4 program. And the victims of the T4 program were not Jews, but rather ethnic German and Austrians, mainly children, but not exclusively children, who the Nazis considered to be unworthy of life. And the reason they considered these individuals to be unworthy of life was uh, because of various illnesses or medical conditions or disabilities that the victims may have had. So the Nazis introduced a program of widespread euthanasia. That was the term that they used, euthanasia, but it was murder, to eliminate individuals, especially children, who were disabled or otherwise incapable of participating in what the Nazis considered to be ordinary society. And when all was said and done, the T4 program, which was largely administered by medical officials in Germany, doctors and nurses, we have a tally of victims that approaches 300,000. About 200,000 of the victims were Germans and Austrians, and the other 100,000 or so came from elsewhere in Europe. Most of the damage was done by the end of 1941. The reason that I raise this point is because the methods of mass killing, which were later implemented against European Jews in the Holocaust, were actually developed to a considerable extent, developed and refined during the T4 program. And many of the officials which were involved in the development of these mass killing techniques, including the use of toxic gas chambers, were also the ones who were responsible for setting up the killing machinery during the Holocaust. So there was a transfer of skills, so to speak, from one sort of department to another. Now, the T4 program can't really be categorized as a genocide because the victims in large part didn't really fit the criteria that, for example, we find in the UN definition of genocide, but it was certainly a mass murder, and the techniques of mass murder used during T4 were then implemented with extremely destructive effect during the genocidal policies that were carried out in the form of the Holocaust. But as far as the early measures went, we find that many Polish Jews were resettled in the German-occupied part of Poland known as the General Government during the early part of the German occupation in Poland up until 1941, and they were basically ghettoized. They weren't imprisoned in camps or that sort of thing, as we come to know during the later part of the war, but they were forced to live in ghettoized neighborhoods in various Polish cities, Warsaw, Lublin, Krakow, etc. And in these ghettos, it was very difficult to make any kind of living. And as a consequence, more and more of the residents of the ghettos began to die during 1939, 40, and 41 from neglect because they didn't have access to proper medical treatment or sufficient nourishment. And in this sense, we can sort of compare death by neglect to the victims of the Armenian genocide who died of exposure or hunger or thirst while they were being put on the forced marches from their homes down toward Aleppo and the Syrian desert. So there's kind of a parallel there, although the scale in the case of the Second World War is going to be much larger than we see in the case of the Turkish Armenians. There were some policy discussions at this time about taking all of these Jews who were being concentrated in the general government district and sending them, to exile in the island of Madagascar off of the east coast of Africa. But this wasn't really a realistic policy because it would have been nearly impossible to transport millions of people to Madagascar from Central Europe as long as Britain was active in the war and the Royal Navy was essentially in control of many of the shipping lanes around the South Atlantic and North Africa. There would be no way for ships carrying these displaced people to even reach Madagascar. But even if the scheme was fanciful, we should keep in mind that the goal of deportation, mass deportation of Jews to some place like Madagascar, was in fact not that much different than forcing Turkish Armenians to exile in the Syrian desert. They were meant to be sent to Madagascar, effectively marooned and abandoned to their fate, which would probably be mass starvation and mass death by neglect. So again, one can see parallels here in the approaches to genocide in both conflicts. I'm going to leave aside for now the phase of mass murder which was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union in the second half of 1941 and the early part of 1942, because we've effectively already described those developments back in the lecture of the 24th of January. So I'll jump forward to the shift from mass murder out in the open, such as we saw perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen, to the sort of institutionalized mass murder or genocide that developed from 1942 to 1945. And generally speaking, as I mentioned a moment ago, the line of demarcation here was the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, named for the home where the conference was organized and hosted in the Wannsee suburb of Berlin. And the conference was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, who was at that time chief of the Reich Security Main Office in the SS, as well as Heydrich's deputy or assistant, Adolf Eichmann. And basically, Heydrich, in his position as chief of the RSHA, or the Reich Security Main Office, was responsible for organizing and implementing the policies of institutionalized mass murder. So Heydrich and Eichmann were not actually making the policy at this time. The policies came down from the highest levels of the National Socialist regime, and not usually in any sort of written instructions, but more tacitly through verbal instructions, sort of often vague verbal instructions that suggested that it was time to eliminate all of the European Jews. And Heydrich and Eichmann gathered a number of officials that were involved in administering the occupied territories and explained to them how this process was going to unfold in broad brushstrokes, setting in motion the period of institutionalized or institutional mass murder. And what we find here then is a synthesis of various elements and techniques of killing, some which came from T4, some which came from the experience in the Soviet Union, as far as the delivery of toxic gas was concerned, as far as the structure and development of the so-called camp facilities, which would form the basis of the extermination centers. And then it remained as well to develop all of the transportation infrastructure, which would have to come into play as far as deporting European Jews from their home countries to the extermination facilities, which were almost without exception situated in occupied Poland. And the individuals who did all of the thinking and planning in such matters were not Adolf Hitler or Heinrich Himmler or Hermann Goering or other very, very powerful members of the regime. They were more of the middle manager types, like Reinhard Heydrich or Adolf Eichmann and various others, many, many others, who had middle management positions in the regime, and had to come up with the solutions to pursue this widespread policy of genocide, which was going to be implemented. And again, here, I think we can at least draw some general comparisons to the situation that unfolded with respect to the Armenians